Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
And thank you so much for joining us today at Science and Wisdom Live. As you very well know, given your extensive contribution to this project, the aim of Science and Wisdom Live is to bring scientific knowledge and the wisdom of contemplative traditions together.
And this is why we believe it would be very valuable for our audience to hear how you've integrated these two aspects in your own life, Scott. So you're not only a Buddhist practitioner and teacher, but also a renowned visual artist. And we were wondering if you could tell us a little about your life's journey and how you came to this moment in life.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me on the other side of the interview seat, or the interview Zoom, I guess. That's a long answer, I guess, if you wanted the whole thing. But I'll tell you, hopefully, some of the interesting highlights. I was born into an artistic family, which was a big part of it. Both of my parents were artists in New York City. They were part of the Andy Warhol scene. They used to go to Andy Warhol parties, and my dad studied with some relatively well-known abstract expressionist painters. And so I grew up in a very creative household and also a spiritual household, a really uniquely strange one because my mother came from a Jewish background. My dad had a Jewish mom and a, atheist, communist, like German dad. But they converted to Christian Science, which is a religion a lot of people I don't think know of anymore. There are not many people who follow Christian Science anymore. And it's best known because Christian scientists don't go to doctors. They don't take medicine. They rely on prayer for healing. And that can get problematic, especially for kids. But luckily, we didn't get very sick when we were kids. So, I'm fine. I won't dwell on that strangest part of Christian Science, which would be interesting to talk about some other time. But what was great about it was that the religion has a view of God that is completely immaterial. So the idea of God in Christian Science was just all of the good things in the universe. And in fact, they have these synonyms like life, truth, love, et cetera, like beautiful intelligence also. So there's all the things most people can agree on that are, the good qualities in life, are noble aspirations. The other thing is that Christian Science has a very extreme view of reality, which is that only the mental is real and that the physical is like a projection of the mental. And that's in Tibetan Buddhism, that is actually one of several different tenet systems that you study in trying to understand reality. And it was even the system of Atisha, who created like the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. So it's not an obscure view at all. And so in hindsight, I feel really grateful for being raised in that religion because it got me, even though I don't believe that mind only point of view, that there's only mind, it got me ready for something much more like Buddhism, where you're looking at how the mind is primary in your experience, how the mind is really the first but really the only thing that we experience are the world and the universe and other people through is filtered through our mind. So that's just a little bit about my childhood. And I grew up wanting to be some combination of a scientist and an artist, and or a inventor and an artist. I think that was more like that. I think I grew up wanting to be some combination of an inventor and an artist, and that's what I grew up to be. I was just one of these people who knew what I wanted to do from when I was very young, and my parents were very encouraging. They said from an early age, do whatever you want with your life and we'll love you. You can be a truck driver, or you can be a scientist, whatever you like. So that gave us freedom to explore. So anyway, by the time I got to college, I had all of these, other experiences, including with computers. I was really, really into computers when I was a kid. I had an Apple II computer in 1980. I was 10 years old. I got an Apple II computer that I worked really hard, like for almost a year with me and my brother, saving up money, working little jobs, and with some help from my parents and grandparents. And I also really always loved computers for a very similar reason as, interest in spirituality and art, which is that with computers, you create time varying experiences. So with a computer, you create something that reacts and changes, something that's like a little universe, so a little system that can take inputs and make responses. And yet, where does it exist? Even as like a 10-year-old kid, I was really fascinated when I turn off the computer, the screen goes blank, and really I would open up the top and look in there at the chips. And the computers were very simple back then, just this little circuit board. And I would think about that for a long time. Like, how does this happen? Where are colors and sounds and then movements when you attach it to motors? How does that happen? That connection from like the infinitely small and the movement of things that are almost like thought. So for me, the connection with computers wasn't so much about like technology as it was about another spiritual exploration, believe it or not. It's the most immaterial medium that we have ever created as human beings. It really, when you try to search for a computer program or its operation, it's not in a data center in Utah or in our laptop or in a disk, when we used to use disks. It's not in any of those places. So anyway, that was kind of my childhood. And as I grew up, I went to college. I studied computer science and art. I got degrees in computer science, art, and film, and undergraduate and then graduate degree, not a PhD, but master's. And then I pursued kind of both careers. I pursued art as a hobby for a long time and made digital art and exhibited digital art kind of in my spare time. And then for my career, I worked for a couple different people. I haven't worked for very many other people. I've mostly started my own companies, but I worked at Adobe initially with some friends on a program called After Effects, which is a product that lets you do special effects in video. Very early, my friends created that program and I was working with them for a while. But then pretty soon I went on and I started creating my own companies, all companies that combined creativity and technology. And, we may ask more about that later, but that's been most of my career, is creating interactive experiences, interactive fine art, interactive science museum exhibitions, and then later going to apps, creating art apps and music apps, and working with and collaborating with certain musicians like Philip Glass and Bjork and so on. So that's been my career. And then most recently, of course, I've found a little free time now to focus on spirituality almost full time with this podcast, Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment.
I'd be interested in hearing more about this podcast series that you started a little over a year ago, in which you present the Buddhist teachings from a secular perspective. Why do you think this is important, and how can it benefit contemporary society?
So I became interested in Buddhism 20 something years ago, maybe 25 years ago, from my brother, who married a Chinese woman, and he went to Tibet, and that's how he discovered it originally. And it's quite a steep path getting into Tibetan Buddhism. I had a Tibetan teacher and he taught in Tibetan and it was translated. And most of all, there's a lot of ideas that are foreign to our culture and that don't seem verifiable by science right now, such as reincarnation, past and future lives, karma, a law that says everything that happens to you is because of something you did in the past. Other realms, like not just other planets, but other realms like hell realms and so on. So all those things were pretty far out, but the benefits were so strong, and I had such a strong sense of admiration for His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other people in his tradition, that I just felt like if I'm going to learn this, I will, listen a little bit critically, but just sort of listen to what they have to say for a while, for quite some time. And then I found my own path to, believing, and then, maybe putting on the shelf some parts of the teachings. But I was invited to start teaching meditation in 2007, about 13 years ago. And at that point, I asked advice of my teachers, especially Venerable Sangye Kadro, who wrote the great book, How to Meditate, and Venerable Rene Fusey, who's my closest teacher, a couple other people. And they all gave me great advice on teaching. But what I found was we were trying to go according to the Lam Rim, which is an ordered sequence of topics in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, that is very, very effective in training the mind gradually towards deeper and deeper states of understanding yourself, understanding the world, and taming your mind and bringing it towards its best qualities. And so we, the spiritual program coordinator and the center director at the time, Venerable Chukyi, she really wanted to always go through the Lam Rim in order, and I thought that was a great idea too. So we did it. But what I found was certain topics in this meditation class, I would teach twice a week on like Tuesdays and Saturdays, and in this meditation class, they really did not land that well, certain topics. So for example, there's a topic called the preciousness of your life, which seems like it should be simple. Our life is really precious, right? I think we can all feel that for sort of obvious reasons, like where do we come from? Where are we going? How do we get here? It's nice to be alive. And you can go a lot further with those thoughts. But in the traditional Buddhist approach, it's like one sentence that combines all of those seemingly supernatural beliefs at once, that I've been born endless times. Most of the time it was in realms that were awful, and it's because of things I did in my past. And now finally I'm born human because of some good I did I don't even remember. I better take advantage of that so I don't get reborn a turtle again or something worse, or a ghost or a hell being, okay? And I'm not saying anything about whether I myself, believe in those things right now, but just how hard it is for an ordinary person coming into what's called an introductory meditation class, open to everybody, hearing those ideas. And so I started thinking and making notes and talking to my teachers too, and reading the Dalai Lama's books, because the Dalai Lama has written a lot about this in Beyond Religion, Ethics for New Millennium. He keeps writing more and more books on this topic of how to make the Buddhist teachings open to everybody, non-religious, scientific, secular. Over and over again, His Holiness has emphasized this point in depth. But in his books, there aren't guided meditations at the end of his books, though. It's actually more, I think, a kind of invitation to anyone who reads them to try to take his teachings into practice in whatever work we're doing. So I started making notes for this about 8 or 9 years ago, something like that. And also experimenting, again, with the, some blessings of my teachers, to try to do the meditations in a more secular way. And they seem very effective with people. And also it seemed like people were benefiting in some ways more. I mean, certainly they're benefiting by coming back and continuing to meditate, but also feeling like the teachings were meeting them where they were in our culture, in our time, with our beliefs. So that was the inspiration for it. And then I had hoped I would get to this a lot sooner. Like a lot of projects, there's a program called Scrivener that a lot of writers use and that I use. And I was gradually filling that up with little drafts and ideas, hundreds and hundreds. And so gradually my life got to a point to about 2 years ago where I could steer off of the career track a little bit and focus on this. And so just about a little more than a year ago, I told my friend Stephen Butler about the idea, and he's also been studying at the same center in San Francisco, Sei Chenling as me. And he volunteered to be a co-founder with me. He's an incredible audio producer and a very dedicated student, and also more of a scholar than I am. So the two of us founded this podcast together, Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. And we started out trying to go through that sequence, go through the Lam Rim sequence in the first year. Tibetan Buddhism is broken into very big chunks and sequences. So we did a 1-year introduction to this stages of the path, like the Lam Rim. from a secular perspective. And then we also introduced now an interview series so we can get kind of much more expert people than myself to talk about some of these topics. And we alternate between discussions and guided meditations. So that's it in a nutshell, is trying to meet people where they are, people who are skeptical, but curious, like skeptical in a really healthy way, like the way a true scientist should be, open-minded, curious, people who only believe in what science has established, because it's a slippery slope once you start believing in other things, right? I mean, we see, for terrible cases, you see terrorists smashing into the World Trade Center because they believe they're going to be reborn in a better place for that act. And so I think you always ask yourself, if you start believing in things that you can't prove through like the scientific method, where does it end? What criteria do you use for establishing that? So it's specifically geared towards those kind of people, but also people who've had a little bit of experience with meditation. Of course, people are welcome who haven't, but I think the ideal person has had a little experience with meditation, with apps like Calm or Headspace or 10% Happier. And those apps focus on meditation more as the therapeutic approach, where people are having a problem, like I'm having trouble sleeping, I'm feeling anxious, and then what meditation can I use as a treatment to help me with that, which is a wonderful approach. Skeptic's path is meant for a stage that comes, I think, a little bit later, where people start to look at why meditation was invented in the first place and realize, oh, there's something even deeper here than the incredible therapeutic benefits, which is to maximize my human potential. That's what meditation was designed for, is to bring out all of your best qualities and help you be of the greatest benefit in the world, make the deepest, closest connections to the people around you in life. Who wouldn't want that? And so that's the approach that we take. And it's specifically, I'm often very specifically saying it is not therapeutic. I am not a psychologist. I'm also not a Dharma teacher. I'm a peer. I'm a friend. The three of us, we're all peers trying to, wrestle with these ideas of Buddhism and how to adapt them to the modern world. And for people who have major psychological problems, I recommend they actually seek out professional help and therapeutic approaches. But for people like us with like a normal level of delusions and like a functional level of delusions and mental problems, this is a developmental path. Stephen often says what we do is secular and developmental. It's secular because you don't have to have any belief. It's developmental because it's based in a real deep, proven tradition that can develop your mind systematically, slowly and systematically towards its greatest potential.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like it will benefit pretty much anyone who would listen to it. So I wonder if you could tell us about the basics of meditation, Scott. What are the most important things to keep in mind when trying to learn how to meditate? And do you have any advice for people who struggle with meditation?
Yeah, I do have some advice, and I think it goes against some of the common wisdom, mostly from my empirical analysis of various people who come to the classes. So first of all, I think I'll start out with what some of my teachers' advice. When I first started out, Geshe Dakpa, a Tibetan teacher who I started with in San Francisco, he said, start small. Establish a 5-minute meditation practice and stick with that for a long time before you change it. And so I took that very literally. I had a 5-minute meditation practice for 3 years, and it really, it benefited me to an extraordinary degree. And I think understanding how habit works with your mind, that it does take time to establish habits. Like they've even done studies, neurologically, you need 3 or 4 weeks, I think, for your average person to start building a new neural pathway. And it's not like it's just firmly cemented then, it keeps going. But if you can get to that stage where you've meditated for a year, 2 years, then not like you're a yogi or something like that, but you're like a toothbrusher. Most of us won't leave the house before we brush our teeth in the morning, or take a shower or eat breakfast. There's certain things in our routine we just do automatically, we have to do. And establishing meditation in your life like that through this very, the smallest commitment you're able to, I think is very powerful. Doing it in the morning, doing it first thing in the morning, I think is very, very good advice because your mind is so clear and stable, especially if you can leave your phone alone. Meditate before you touch your phone or your iPad or your computer. Just experiment for yourself. Like try a couple days where you don't touch your phone and meditate, then a couple of days where you do your phone first and meditate. I still do that experiment. Like I'm not some perfect person who always sits down. There are mornings there was something exciting I'm interested in and or I was waiting for that I look at the phone first. I tell you every time I don't have the same level of engagement and attention and even compassion that I do on the days that I can start on the cushion before I engage with technology. So that's just about being patient, setting up a habit, making very, very small commitment at first, and then only slowly building on it. You see, because then you can add 5 minutes, add 5 minutes. That's what Venerable Renee said to me: is go slowly, but always be adding. So then you see that in your life. I think all of us in our life, we have things that we're good at, and we keep getting better at them. In general, you're not getting worse. So you can get better at meditation. It's not competitive, but you do get more skilled in it, obviously. The other thing I would say, which is related, is to be really gentle on yourself. And I'll tell you a really good trick for that, which is that I tell people this all the time, usually in the introduction to meditation, is that the days when meditation is hard for you is actually the best meditation, because your motivation for meditating, to meditate just because it's pleasurable or it feels good, is a very fragile motivation, because it's not always going to be that way. So you can compare it to working out. If you do exercise, if you run or swim or whatever, you do yoga, those things don't always feel good, and it takes some effort to do them, but you do them because the benefit, it's a really big benefit. I'm going to live 10 years longer, and my day is going to feel better, and I'll be, I won't have a temper, and my body will be healthy. So it's the same with meditation. When you meditate, knowing that its purpose is to bring out your best qualities, to smooth out that reactivity, then that's a stable motivation that can keep you going forever. And so, but I really think that's the most important point, is that when the meditation feels hard or difficult or you're distracted, I honestly think that's the best day, because you're doing it for the right reason. Like you're doing it because of the benefit and not just because it feels good, like another pleasurable experience, because it would be too fragile if it's, just for the pleasure. So those are about general approaches to meditation. A couple of things about topics. One I'd like to say, which I think does go a little bit against the grain too, is that it's very difficult to meditate on the breath. That is so commonly the first meditation that people are introduced to. And it's an incredible meditation. It's an extraordinary meditation. But I think acknowledging how hard that is, it's an extremely difficult practice to keep your mind on your breath. And it's okay to do the meditation and get distracted from it over and over again. But there are also other types of meditation that beginners can take on that I think are actually more effective. Not that you should abandon the breath, but that there can be a balance between the breath and the other form of meditation, analytical meditation, which is the one we mostly focus on in Skeptic's Path. That was the other reason we formed Skeptic's Path, was that most of the meditation that has become popular is what is called mindfulness meditation, which doesn't precisely map to like the Buddhist definition of mindfulness that I know from our Tibetan tradition. But it tends to focus on stabilizing types of meditation, a meditation that makes your mind calmer, more stable, more relaxed, and that isn't focused on any particular steering of the mind in any direction. It's about kind of stabilizing, calming, accepting, sometimes clearing the mind. And so there's this other form of meditation called analytical meditation, in which you do cultivate thoughts, feelings, emotions deliberately, like a story or a podcast, a TV show. And the right stories can steer your mind towards cultivating certain qualities like love, compassion, patience, understanding the impermanent nature of reality. And so that's the other thing I would say, is that analytical meditation is so much easier, I think, especially for Westerners. And not only that, I've really found people can concentrate for long stretches. People can concentrate for an hour, for half an hour easily. You know, the sessions were always an hour that we were doing, you know, in the Buddhist centers. And nobody ever got up and left. You know, if you sit down by yourself, it's pretty hard to sit for an hour. But with a guided analytical meditation, I found people get absorbed because it's like storytelling, you know, and they say, some people say that's almost the fundamental differentiator of human beings, is our ability to tell stories and to hear stories. And the point of stories is that you learn without having to experience something yourself, right? You learn from someone else's experiences and you simulate it in your brain, and it can get incorporated into your worldview. And so that analytical form of meditation, I think, is excellent for beginners, and you can get some really, really excellent results right away, especially with a couple of different topics. One is impermanence. Impermanence is the topic that I found resonates almost universally with newcomers. Like when I had individual friends in my life ask to guide them through a meditation, they never done meditation before, I would always do this topic of impermanence, because it's quite profound in a lot of ways. But it awakens you to something that's always there, that you realize everything's constantly changing. My body, the air, the house around me, the people around me. It's common sense, and yet it's awe-inspiring. And then it has this great side effect of helping you to be prepared for the constant change in the world around you, which is the thing that mostly annoys us and makes life difficult, is all that constant change. So yeah, so you can see there's a few points that are a little bit different, you know, that I've found are useful for beginners, at least the type of beginners, you know, I've encountered in like urban settings, and you know, people, professional, educated people who tend to be the kind of folks that come to the urban Dharma centers or listen to our podcast.
Thank you so much. These are wonderful advices, and I'll try and put them in practice myself. I'm very curious. I wonder if you could briefly tell us what you were doing in those 5 minutes of meditation when you just started.
Oh, when I just started? Sure. Well, this Tibetan system is quite beautiful, because there's always an arc. There's kind of, you know, because I studied film and animation, writing also, so literature. So what's nice is that there's always an arc in the Tibetan meditation. So even in 5 minutes, there were about 6 different phases, and some was that stabilizing phase. Then there's a phase of opening your heart, very, very quickly. It could just be through 4 lines, prayers, but trying to equalize your feelings for all people. Just everyone deserves kind of like universal human rights, really, is a way of thinking about it. And then wanting everybody to have everything they need, which is a simple definition. That's love. Love in Buddhism is such a simple definition of just wanting people to be happy and have what they need. And then compassion, of wanting to take away people's suffering. And then the kind of joy, which is strangely is the most complicated of those 4 steps of opening your heart, because it can be a joy in the great teachers that, you know, kind of rejoicing in their qualities, or it can be aspiring for beings to become enlightened, like to be completely free of suffering forever. But you can do that prayer just in 20 seconds, though, you know, like 5 seconds per line, and even right quickly. But you know, they call it the 4 immeasurables. And then there's like refuge, you know, and that's a little complicated from a Buddhist perspective, but just thinking about where these teachings came from, what the teachings are, and all the people that support you. So that's the basics. There were prayers, you know, the way it is done in Tibetan Buddhism. All of those things were expressed as little verses that were translated from Tibetan into English, and they're a little story, little verses that bring you through those feelings. But what's important is not just to read them, but and they're not even the original words, right? They're translated. So to bring those ideas into your mind. So a little bit of all of those things of generating love, having some peace and mental stability. And then, thinking about some of these other stages of mental development that that they call the Lam Rim, in Buddhism, even very briefly, just as, a very short prayer. And then dedicating all of that, not forgetting at the end to dedicate it all to having a meaningful day and benefiting others, through your day, and at least not harming people. So something like that. That was the way I was meditating then, and it was based in prayers and verses that embody those ideas.
You've been a committed practitioner for more than 2 decades, while at the same time also being a householder with a family and a business. How were you able to reconcile these two very important aspects of your life?
That is a very interesting question. That I can tell you about different ways that I've approached these two things over time. I'd like to talk a little bit at first. So at first, I approached my practice in a therapeutic perspective, the way I think a lot of people did, where I'd actually reached a point in my life I was actually achieved a lot of things I wanted to achieve in life, but still found I had a lot of mental disturbance, anxiety, frustration, sometimes the different negative feelings. And so the practice became a kind of refuge that when I was taking teachings or when I was meditating, it felt really good. And I felt like I was escaping those problems. And there's a lot of good to that, but I would have to say that there was a kind of dualism there, where there was my everyday life and then there was a spiritual life, and especially how different it is. Like once I started going on retreat, again, at points, as for some long stretches, my life was really difficult for different reasons. And so during those times, I would remember driving to this retreat center. I've done most of my retreats at a place called the Vajrapani Institute. That was, one of Lama Yeshe's first centers. And I can recall coming to that place. I'll tell you to make it real for listeners, I've been married, twice. And so in the first, I had a marriage that was not going well. I had a business that was, having financial problems. And so I would remember driving up to Vajrapani, and as soon as I saw it, after you go through this very long drive through the woods, it's actually like a pilgrimage just driving there, because it's about a 2.5-hour drive from here. And the last part is on a dirt road through the deep forest. And then when it finally emerges there from out of the forest, feeling this incredible sense of relief, and appreciation and gratitude. And I'm not saying anything that those are nice things, actually. But what I'm saying is that there was a real dichotomy in my life where I felt like that spiritual part was really good and happy, and then my everyday part was really, really difficult and painful. And I don't think that was the healthiest approach, actually, although it really helped me. It was really therapeutic at the time. But later, when I'll tell you where the breakthrough happened, is that I had a retreat, and it was during that financial crisis in 2008, 2009. It was a long retreat. It was like a 1-month retreat, but I was the president of a business that was failing. So I didn't feel like I could just leave that completely for a month and maybe let it completely fail and all the employees, let go. But at the same time, I thought it was not wise to not go on retreat either and just focus on the business. So I kind of mixed it. I talked to my teacher, and he said, oh, okay. So I would kind of check in during the between sessions in the afternoon. And I even had to go out like maybe once or twice to go have some important meeting. And at the time I had thought, oh, that's annoying. I'm not really getting the benefit of this retreat. Like, it's such a special retreat and I'm interrupting it with my worldly life. But at the end, I was so happy for that experience, because I felt like it finally taught me how to integrate the two things, that how I could have some, and I'm not recommending this for people to go do your work during the break session in your retreat. But for me, I kind of, at the time, I felt like I had to do that, because of some commitments I had. But because it was such a long period, it was 1 month of doing really intense meditation and then still doing some work. It really integrated those two things finally for me, so that I felt like they were more the continuity of one experience and not a separate spiritual life from the work life.
It sounds like you could be more present and compassionate with your co-workers and bring the benefits of the practice also into their lives as well.
Yeah, yeah. It made it very much that, you know, I was more aware of the values of, you know, the spiritual values, yeah, during my everyday life at work. Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely the case. And then, you know, it gradually turned into doing more at home, you know, because like home life and my work life became very, very happy. And so, you know, now it's more like, how do I make more time at home? So now I have, you know, more meditation, you know, at home. Usually I do it very early. But feeling, and, you know, there's my altar right there, you know, that's where I work right there. So I think more a sense that spiritual life is integrated with everyday life, you know, as what that's gradually turned into. Yeah.
It's beautiful. It reminds me of many of the Zen stories where eventually the monk needs to come back to the marketplace and into the city to actually
Yeah.
experience both life and contemplative wisdom at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So Scott, there is also an interesting contemplative practice involved in creating something. And I was very struck by what you were saying earlier about your early experiences with computers. So for example, when I paint something, I often experience that there's a shift from doing to letting something happen. And it's almost as if one starts to serve a larger vision than oneself, and one can, yeah, can really serve that. And in that respect, would you say that there's a connection between the arts and contemplative wisdom as well?
Yeah. And because I saw that so much in my parents and also myself when I was young, like really our religion wasn't Christian Science, but it was art. You know, that was our true religion at home. And the benefits of art and music and things like that are that when you're doing it and you're really into it, you're not thinking about yourself. I think that is the primary benefit in the way that activity becomes something like spiritual practice, because you are the experience. Like that's it. And it's kind of amazing when you get out of that trance. Like even editing video is like that too. Editing video, painting, computer programming, you know, in some ways. But you completely lose your sense of yourself and you're completely engaged with what you're doing. And the science today would say that it's not the particular activity. It's actually not that it's art or that it's editing video or programming a computer, but it's actually just the fact that all you are doing is having your mind on the experience. But the particular power of art is that you are in this loop. Like there are many different kinds of work and activities, and most of our work and activity involves like kind of constant input output, but art involves much more like a loop within your own mind. And when you loop into it like that, and I'm separating kind of the mind from the self, right? Like the self is sort of an illusion of something separate, but the mind is something deeply interconnected. And I think anyone who's had, you know, some experience with art or music has that feeling that something is more flowing through them, or you're interacting with, like, the medium is very important, you know, like different types of markers, pens, pencils. I still do a ton of real art, you know, on paper. And it's amazing, just that tiny bit of interaction with the world, like the different types of friction that comes from a marker, a pen, or a brush completely changes what you create and how you create. And you create because you're interacting with the universe, right? You're interacting with physics, the universe, and then your senses giving you this illusion of color and tactility and so on. But then there is, I think, something a little bit mystical that it's hard to explain, you know, where ideas come from, because you also, especially in your early days as an artist, like, because I remember when I sort of discovered my style, like when I was drawing, what you need to do is you create the habit, just like meditation, right? I think you become a real artist when you start doing it every day. That's actually the main criteria. You don't have to wait for someone else to tell you you're an artist, but if you're not making art every day, I don't think you're yet an artist. How can you call yourself something you don't do? But once you do, I think you find that there's an extraordinary like discovery. Something is flowing through you. Like you're part of something much bigger than what you think you are. You know, maybe you're discovering what you really are through doing art. And I think that's what people love about being artists and about making art. It's you discover. And also one of the biggest things is that often your quote mistakes end up being your biggest discoveries. So that openness, like when to get into that state of openness where a mistake becomes maybe a discovery of what you do for the rest of your life.
It's often said that in art we find something like a purposiveness without purpose, so without an end goal, and that allows a lot of freedom, right? And maybe that comes close to meditation and the open mind that we discover. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. What's the purpose of art? I used to, because I did computer art, people were always very confused, like, what are these programs like? What are they used for? And I would always, I think one of the great rhetorical techniques is to agree with people. I think it's one of the most powerful ways of communicating. And so that's what I would do is actually, I would say like, yeah, they're useless programs. Like, that's what I make. I make useless computer programs. And then they say, oh, okay, you're agreeing with me? I say, yeah, they're as useless as a song, as a poem, as a painting. They're useless in just the same way. Right.
It's a wonderful kind of uselessness. I know from previous conversations and also from your collaboration with Science and Wisdom Live that you have a great interest in science. Do you find that this scientific knowledge of yours enriches your contemplative practice? And obviously, this is a very big question. How do you think that the dialogue between science and contemplative traditions can help us tackle the big challenges of our society?
Yeah, so I'm so passionate about science. And at the same time, I've never done a scientific experiment. Like there's such a big difference between loving science and being a scientist. It is so hard to be a scientist. I respect those people so much, and it's almost a nightmare because you're held to such an extraordinary level of critique and performance. So it's very, very hard to be a scientist. And I really respect them, but it's so fun and delightful to appreciate science and to read about it and to listen to it. It started for me, I think, when I was 10 years old and I saw the original Cosmos with Carl Sagan, and I was completely blown away because I was raised religiously, but I felt like the ideas of science's understanding of the universe was way bigger and more interesting and more wondrous than the religious stories of the universe. Like, hey, okay, God made it, then he took a break. Like that is not that interesting of a story to me, and then I'm always thinking, where did God come from? Who made God? I just felt like there's in the new Cosmos, the one with Neil deGrasse Tyson, there was one episode where they talk about Giordano Bruno, in the 16th century, like the great, well, he was a lot of things, but astronomer, I guess you'd say, philosopher. But he very firmly believed, he was the first person that really in the Western world to say every star is another sun.
Yes.
And around every other sun are planets. And around many of those planets, there's probably life. And there's no center to the universe. Like he said all those things, which is amazing because those are only, especially the last one about there being no center to the universe, like that we've only figured out during the last century.
It was profoundly different from what was believed at the time, and he paid a price for this.
Yeah, they burned him at the stake. The Inquisition, they burned him at the stake. But the thing he said, he was so surprised that the church objected to his ideas, because during his trial, he said, I said something like, your God is too small. He said, your God is so much bigger than you think it is. And that is honestly the way I feel about science. I feel that when you really deeply get into the understanding of the universe, it is way more profound and awe-inspiring than any religious story. Sorry, including even the Tibetan ones of like, the cosmology. And his Dalai Lama says this, so I feel comfortable saying it. Like the Dalai Lama himself has said, Tibetan view of cosmology needs revision. It's like it's you know, because they talk about 4 continents and so on. Like it's this based on a mountain in Tibet, and we know that it's a little different. You know, the universe is made up of galaxies and so on, and there was a big bang, and maybe there was, you know, prior big bangs that we don't know about. So I think the awe-inspiring aspect of science is so powerful, and if you incorporate it into some, it can't only be material, but when you combine that with the awe-inspiring inner reality, partially that we know about from neuroscience and psychology, but then also that we know about through inner science, you know, and that is where Buddhism, you know, knocks it out of the park, and you can't compete with the contemplative tradition of 2,500 years looking inward, because there is a science of the mind that is much more developed than Western psychology, and that very precisely breaks down mental experience and also shows you how to change that experience and modify it towards a life of happiness and meaning and connection to others. So, but the Tibetan approach in particular, the Nalanda approach, the approach that came from, you know, the Nalanda monastery in India, was a very critical approach. And not every Buddhist approach has this basis, but the Nalanda approach that the Tibetan Buddhism comes from is that approach of being very critical. The Buddha did say, you know, test everything I say as if it were gold, you know, because in the old days, that was the value. So people would, like, you know, chew it and cut it and burn it. There were these ways to determine whether something was gold back then, before we had, you know, our modern methods. And so the Buddha said to do that. And this Nalanda tradition takes that very seriously and says, if you can't validate something that some of these teachings of the Buddha, then put them aside. You know, it's not necessarily go telling people like it's trash, but put it on the shelf. You know, just put it aside and focus on the aspects that you can validate. You can't accept something on faith. And that's where I see the absolute parallel between at least Tibetan Buddhism and science. Both of them accepting the primacy of experiment and validation. And but in Buddhism, of course, it's the personal validation, like you test it yourself. In science, it's also that external critical value validation. So I think that's the difference, right? In science, you subject yourself to tons of external criticism, which you do as a professional Buddhist, you know, as monks and scholars and so on. But as an individual practitioner, it's more on your own, trying to integrate all the sources of wisdom and then see, okay, if I meditate like this, does it have the benefit that they say? So I could go on and on about, you know, science and wisdom, and I love what you're doing with the podcast. But I think that's, you know, that's the main connection, is that the extraordinary sense of awe and wonder and humility. You see, the view, especially since Popper in science, you know, because we used to have empiricism, which just believed this idea that you collect evidence and then you just look at it, and you could look at evidence and come up with a theory. The modern view of science is says, no, the mind comes first. You always have a theory. You have a theory or a model of the universe. You propose a falsifiable experiment, and then you run the experiment and subject it to the criticism of all the people who disbelieve you the most. That's what's so cool about science, is you invite in the people who are most critical of your work to really prove whether it's right or wrong.
I was always struck by this quote of the Buddha, that he said, you know, never take anything on faith and always test it yourself. So there's a beautiful link there between science and Buddhism.
Yeah, absolutely. But, you know, if you take that seriously, then, you know, there are these aspects of Buddhism that if you go to Dharma Center, you hear them all the time. And that's what we try to do at Skeptic's Path, is admit those elephants in the room and say, okay, can we establish karma? Can we establish rebirth? If we can't, how can we still get the benefit from these meditations, you know, in a life where we can't prove those things?
So Scott, if the Buddha were alive today, what would you think they would be doing?
That's a funny question. So, well, I think he or she would be giving Zoom lectures, to be honest. But I'll tell you something, like I hear people ask questions like this, and I think an even more important answer is that, like, the Buddha is alive today. You know, there are I think this is the thing that for people who haven't had the chance to stumble across a great teacher, I think that's what's really extraordinary, is that, at least as far as I'm concerned, that level of teaching is accessible to us right now through thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of great teachers on earth in tons of different traditions, not even all in Buddhism too, in Christian and Islam and secular too, activist secular people. I think there's extraordinary wisdom available. I won't say that they're Buddhas. Some of them might be, actually. I think some of them very much might be. But there are beings who can provide us the wisdom that a Buddha, that the historical Buddha, if he were alive, would impart to us. And so that's when, but I kind of like to turn that into a joke, because it sort of cracks me up, because I was taking classes with Venerable Rene Fusey, who's really my closest teacher. I've learned everything about meditation from a very dedicated student, Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Somewhat reclusive, like you'll never get him to do an interview, unfortunately. I've tried. But his teachings were so extraordinary. And I was driving down to Vajrapani, where he was the teacher, every week. And it was on, I don't know what it was, Tuesday nights, I think. For years, he was teaching the whole Lam Rim. And it was 2.5 hours each way. It was a long trip, like 4 or 5 hours every night. And people were saying, why are you doing this? And I would say, well, imagine you were in Jerusalem, and it was a couple thousand years ago. And someone would say, oh, this guy's teaching, like everyone's been talking about him, like Jesus of Nazareth, like, and you're like, yeah, I've heard he's pretty good. And it's like, yeah, he's great. He's teaching at this Garden of Gethsemane tonight. It's a nice place. It's a nice evening. Like, why don't we go? And I'm like, oh, I had plans. We were supposed to have dinner. I have to close up the shop. Like, you go and tell me how it was, right? But that's what we do, right? Like it is like that just now. Like we all have opportunities like that right now, even tonight. There's probably some teaching we could go listen to that would be transformative. That's by a person with extraordinary qualities. His Holiness the Dalai Lama obviously comes to mind. He's on Zoom all the time and giving extraordinary teachings. But different people have different teachers they resonate with, and it may not be in Buddhism, it may be another religion, or it may be secular. It might be a physicist or an artist. A lot of great artists, I think, actually are deeply spiritually in touch. So that's what I would say, to that answer of if the Buddha was alive today, that the idea that the Buddha is alive, actually, and I don't mean that in some like supernatural new age way. I really, that way of thinking doesn't work very well with me in my mind. But I mean it very practically, that there are people with that wisdom, and if we make a tiny bit of effort, we can find them, and we can really benefit from a tiny bit of our time learning from people who have tamed their minds better than us and studied, authentic traditions, and found a way to translate it into our language.
That sounds like a wonderful place to bring this interview to a close, and to thank you again for your time and presence with us at Science of Wisdom Live. Thank you.